especially. Let me see. So the what I'm going to share with you today is a short version of an essay that I've been working on for a special issue in Spanish on interactions with public servants and looking at these interactions as sites for the manifestation of sovereignty more than bureaucratic governmentality. And so this special issue is part of an effort to sort of bring a little more linguistic anthropology into the conversation on violence and state sovereignty in Latin America. So the journal that we're working with is in Colombia. It's the Colombian Journal of Anthropology, the Revista Colombiana de Antropología. And so I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to load. That will take me just 1 second. And if you will bear with me. Oh, wait. Oh, okay. And so you can see my PowerPoint at this point, right? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so let me just begin. In 2006, at the age of 15, Lucia Muñoz, that's a pseudonym, crossed the border from Mexico into her native country, the United States. This was only her second time. The first, she barely remembers. She was so young. She crossed as she was entitled to as a US citizen through the main port of entry connecting Tijuana with San Diego, California. She did not speak English, nor could she deploy any other sign of cultural belonging. The only document she had with her was her birth certificate. I'm going to talk today about Lucia's narrative of this crossing, and through that narrative about the interrogation to which she was subjected in the port of entry. I'm interested in the rigidity of the interrogation as a genre and its capacity to divide and ultimately disappear the subject of interrogation. That disappearance resonates in Lucia's larger narrative with the threat of her literal disappearance as the victim of a near kidnapping in Tijuana. The linguistic interruptions and impasses of the narrative and of the interrogation tie these two scenes together. Together, I want to argue, they speak to the constitution of a transnational system of governance that operates on the basis not of differential rights, but of differential vulnerability. That is, people's differential exposure to violence, whether it be sovereign or criminal. In the United States, Lucia had citizenship, but remained an outsider. In Mexico, she belonged, though she had no legal status whatsoever. In both countries, she is what I would call a non-citizen, with the non in, as you see there, in parentheses. I use this term to bring out the ambivalence of inclusion in either nation state for those most chronically exposed to violence. And this is related to, but a little different from, the exclusion on both sides of the border that many scholars have pointed out. In Mexico, Lucia's lack of legal status certainly presented obstacles, but she belonged socially and culturally. Her economic circumstances were not radically distinct from those around her. Instead, her literal lack of citizenship highlights their non-citizenship, again, in parentheses, that of the marginalized who do enjoy or suffer formal belonging. Lucia's non-citizenship in the United States is a mirror image of her Mexican non-citizenship. Here in the US, the violence that she undergoes in the port of entry gives the lie to her formal belonging. As a racialized, or if I may, ethnicized person, her citizenship is not just a matter of diminished or partial rights not fully enjoyed, but of an ambiguous, injurious, and ultimately mysterious inclusion that brings new ills upon the subjects of empire. Citizenship operates as one more modality of subjection to the arbitrary power of the sovereign, despite and amongst all the benefits it undoubtedly does also entail. For this reason, Miguel Diaz-Barriga and Margaret Dorsey call it necro-citizenship. Though my interest is ultimately also in the use of the exception to govern, I prefer the term non-citizenship here because my focus is not on the threat of death per se, but on the ambivalence of this condition and how it materializes in the interruptions and impasses of interaction and narrative. Non-citizenship works as what Derrida called a pharmacon, a drug that cures and kills, that promises to remedy the ills of one's social condition, but ends up merely transmogrifying and sometimes multiplying them. I met Lucia during my doctoral research in Tijuana. I was living with a neighbor of hers, and I often heard comments about Lucia and her sister. Despite being US citizens, they lived in what the women of this small squatter settlement considered la peor miseria, the most miserable poverty. Intrigued, I asked for an introduction. Gari, the older sister, welcomed me immediately. Lucia was present during that first visit, but the dynamic between the sisters was the same one that persisted for years. Lucia let Gari do the talking. At the age of 19, Gari was clearly the head of the household. When we met, she was just undertaking a project that came to seem to me Herculean, repatriating herself and her sister, along with their children, to the United States. I began to accompany them in this project, and in fact, the conversation that I'll present today took place in a neighborhood park in San Diego, while Lucia and I waited for Gari to finish her appointment at a government agency. Given the sisters' interactional dynamic, I learned their family history more from Gari than from Lucia. In any case, Gari remembered more clearly their childhood in California. She remembered the games and scoldings, the mischief that they'd get into as kids. She remembered English, which Lucia had to learn later in life, and which Gari was just beginning to use again in her recent bureaucratic encounters. Gari remembered too a room they weren't supposed to enter, full of strangers recently arrived from Mexico. Without compunction, she told me her father had been a pollero, someone who helped migrants cross the border for a fee. Above all, she remembered him, an almost compulsively generous man who would do anything for a total stranger. And she remembered the disaster that struck the family when he died. After his death, the girl's mother lost her legal status in the United States and returned to Tijuana. Gari was sent to live with relatives in the US, but soon wound up in Tijuana too. She lived on the street before setting up with her first partner when she was 13. Their mother took Lucia with her to Tijuana from the start, but Lucia did not grow up only with her. She also spent periods of time with other relatives and in and out of an orphanage. Since she was small, Lucia knew she was a US citizen, and she burned with curiosity to see the country where she was born. The opportunity arose when she went to live with some relatives who attended church regularly in San Diego. Lucia wanted to go along, but sometime before she had lost her birth certificate, and she had to enlist an aunt to get a new one. Lucia narrated this part of the story, the overcoming of obstacles, with all of her teenaged enthusiasm. When this aunt finally gave her her birth certificate, she was wild with excitement. It was a Saturday, and the very next day, there would be an outing to San Diego. Tío, uncle, Lucia voiced herself, bursting into the house. Ya tengo mi acta, sí puedo ir. I got my birth certificate, I can go. Lucia's aunt and uncle, though, only had tourist visas, and they were afraid that if they crossed with her, their visas might be taken away from them. It's widely believed that US border officers consider any social relationship across legal statuses to be conducive to unauthorized immigration. Therefore, a family friend with US legal residency accompanied Lucia instead, and she was without her family's support in the moment of crossing. During her interrogation, this man, the family friend, was handcuffed behind her. In his classic essay, Replies and Responses, Irving Goffman undertakes a magisterial critique of the question-answer pair as a model for understanding interaction. This approach dominated the field at the time, that was 1976. It treated question and answer as a unit defining the basic roles of speaker and hearer. To grasp any interaction, it was thought, one only had to discover how these pair-part couplets were linked together to form chains. Goffman argues that this approach reduces communication to a cybernetic-style system explainable on the basis of a simple list of requirements and constraints. Oh, I'm sorry. That was not the right PowerPoint. Such a list would represent a set of universal structural conditions for communication. For example, how to know one is indeed communicating. Cybernetic solution would be to check if what B says counts as a response to what A said, and according to the result, A will then have particular options for opening the next adjacency pair. Only someone optimistic, Goffman writes, about the possibility of excluding all cultural factors from the communicative process could subscribe to such an ideology of communication. For him, the cultural factors are what turn communication into an open-ended game. We don't just respond to what was said to us, but in face of the communicative situation as a whole. It's in the response oftentimes that we construct the meaning of what has previously been said. Interaction doesn't even need words, but can be carried out through gesture and bodily expression. Ordinary talk, Goffman writes, ordinarily has less ping pong. Indeed, his essay is a kind of homage to the indeterminacy and freewheeling nature of interaction, what Goffman calls the dance in talk. When it's freest, he writes, and these are the closing words of the essay, there is no box. The linguistic ideology that, to quote Goffman again, deals with talk as a communications engineer might, is not, however, exclusive to a clique of academics. It underlies the interrogation, a genre that seeks to box in communication as much as possible, and that does so precisely by doubling down on the system requirements and constraints of the question-answer pair. Goffman practically predicts the result, the formalization of interaction and the drastic reduction of the role of the person in it. A genre regimented by such an ideology, the reduction of linguistic exchange to a series of questions and answers, seeks to turn interaction into the running of a computer program. So let me see. So at the top of this rather busy slide, what you can see there is a free interpretation in the basic programming language of the interview excerpt that follows. So I will read it first in Spanish. ¿Cuál es tu nombre? Le hago, Lucía Muñoz. ¿Quiénes son tus papás? Ignacio Muñoz Herrera y Victoria Guzmán Salas. ¿Cuándo naciste? El 12 de abril de 1990. Y ya pues no me creían ni me mandaron a revisión. So now in English, what's your name? I'm like Lucia Muñoz. Who are your parents? Ignacio Muñoz Herrera and Victoria Guzmán Salas. Where were you born? When were you born? Sorry. April 12th, 1990. And that's it. They didn't believe me, and they sent me to inspection. In this first round of interrogation, each answer triggers a new question, which seeks to fill in a new data point, name, place of birth, date of birth, and so on. The questions are meant to, and mostly do, produce bite-sized units of information in response, of just the kind that could populate a database. Boxing Lucia's answers into this narrow form, the interrogation produces her as what Gilles Deleuze calls a individual. The interrogation is, of course, an older technology, but its reduction of the individual to a set of data points resonates with 21st century order biometrics, which Louise Amour describes as, quote, a series of dividing practices in which the subject is broken up into calculable risk factors, end quote. The border is often thought of as a sieve, sorting acceptable from unacceptable entrants. But under a biometric model, what it sieves are not whole people so much as individualized ones. Lucia's interrogation breaks that process down for us as officers attempt to break her down into a series of risk factors that they can sift through. However, even as the questions drill insistently towards the extraction of information, the evaluative frame that Lucia provides as narrator reveals an underlying dynamic. No me creían, they didn't believe me. With their implacable rhythm, the questions push Lucia to falter. They push her towards the flaw that might give her away as a criminal, pretending to be someone she's not. As the interrogation progressed, its information-oriented drive fell away, and the second dynamic, the interrogation as an exercise of force, intensified. Lucia narrated the second round just briefly. Y agarró mi mochila y me iban así como con la mano en la espalda, como si fuera una delincuente, o sea, así, ¿no? Y ya pues caminé. Y ya me hicieron varias preguntas, las mismas preguntas, y que dijera la verdad, Le digo, pues son mis papeles. Y agarraron y esculcaron toda mi mochila, hasta mi cartera agarraron, abrieron, hasta el último papel, sacaron y revisaron todo. In English, they grabbed my backpack, they were like, with their hand on my back, as if I were a criminal, I mean, like this, right? And so, well, then I walked. And so then they asked me some questions to the same questions and told me to tell the truth and to tell the truth. I say to them, well, they're my papers. And they started up and rummaged through my whole backpack. They grabbed even my wallet. They opened it. They took out even the last little paper and went through everything. This round took place in the area for secondary inspection, which at the time stood in plain sight just beyond the booths for initial screening. Lucia estimated that this round lasted an hour or two. The hand at her back is repressive and criminalizing in itself, no matter how lightly it may have touched her. In her narrative, this act merits Lucia's strongest evaluative moment yet. She exclaims and appeals directly to me as her listener to recognize and ratify how shocking and distasteful the gesture is. Along with the physical delving into her belongings, this touch marks a turn towards the body that goes right along with the repetition of the questions. Lucia no longer needs to reproduce them, for their ostensible function of information gathering is by now clearly but a pretense. The third round took place in a small room. Me dice la muchacha, dice, ¿cuál es tu nombre? Yo le digo, Lucía Muñoz. No es tu nombre. Sí es mi nombre. No, que no es tu nombre, me decía. Le hace, dime quién eres. Yo le digo, Lucía Muñoz. Dice, no eres tú. Haz de cuenta cómo me decían. ¿Cómo te llamas? Lucía Muñoz. ¿Cómo te llamas? Lucía Muñoz. O sea, varias veces la misma pregunta y yo decía, hasta que le dije, ¿sabes qué es lo que quieras? Le digo, si quieres llévame a juicio, aquí me voy a quedar. Ya me senté, me volvió a parar. Me dice, ¿cuál es tu nombre? Ya le dije otra vez. The girl says to me, what's your name? And I say to her, Lucía Muñoz. Nuh-uh, that's not your name. Yes, it's my name. No, I said it's not your name. She was saying to me. She's like, tell me who you are. And I tell her, Lucía Muñoz. She says, no, it's not you. Imagine what they were talking to me like. What's your name? Lucía Muñoz. What's your name? Lucía Muñoz. I mean, several times over the same question. And I was like, until I told her, know what? Do what you want. I tell her, take me to court if you want. I'm going to stay right here. So I sat down and she made me stand up again. She says to me, what's your name? So I told her again. To pose repeatedly the same question to a prisoner, and that's what Lucia was, is a technique of interrogation approved by Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense of the United States between 2001 2006, and remember that 2006 is when Lucia's interrogation took place. In one of the memorandums that provoked a scandal over the use of torture in Guantanamo, that the question, "What is your name?" was not a question in the usual sense, is underlined by its physical dimension. Lucia had to remain standing. This was, in fact, another technique approved by Rumsfeld. Both are mild compared to others on the list, and presumably they were not the cause of the scandal. Nonetheless, they share the same logic. They're part of a repertoire of techniques that treat interaction as an opportunity to create pressure. As torture, the repeated question works cybernetically. It's a loop, a sequence of code that's executed repeatedly as long as a particular condition holds. In a controlled environment, interaction ritualized as torture can well impose its particular set of system requirements, to recall Goffman's terms. The list of techniques produced by the Secretary of Defense is just that, a list of constraints in a closed system, parallel to the little list Goffman offers, parity. Here, though, there's nothing to laugh about. The engineer's vision of communication is imposed by force. The interrogation room is designed not just to ignore, but to eliminate cultural aspects of communication. It's the deployment of constraints, many of them literal, physical, that guarantees the operability of the question-answer adjacency pair as the basic formula for interaction. In Lucia's case, her interrogator only departs from the questions to deny what Lucia says or to threaten her. Te puedo llevar a juicio. I can take you to court. Denying the truth of Lucia's statements, she cancels her answer and signals that the circuit will repeat. With her threats, the officer uses language to impose another constraint. In this context, questions reveal themselves as, in fact, orders. Dime quién eres. Tell me who you are. Every repetition of the question, "What is your name?" frames the preceding answer not just as false, but as an act of disobedience. Each question demands an answer, orders the prisoner to answer, but where the prisoner is not to be believed, the answer is never enough. If the cybernetic ideology of communication foments the formalization of interaction, as Goffman contended, the interrogation guided by Rumsfeld's techniques takes that formalization to an extreme. The interaction becomes a loop on infinite repeat. If the new entry, that is, Lucia's answer, is the same as the last, the system automatically generates the same question anew. This is the condition that keeps the same sequence of code on repeat. Stereotypically, we think of answers as following upon questions, but here, the programming logic inverts that relation. Once the machine is in motion, there's no internal control to break the cycle. The only thing that can do that is a change in the input. The system, that is, has no way to handle the eventuality the original answer might be true. It's a general problem of torture that it's designed to produce the truth only on the basis of a supposition of falsity. As a result, all that it reliably produces actually is the subject of torture as a liar. Torture's cybernetic structure helps understand that its objective is not to arrive at the truth, but to create it. This disdain for the truth bears the mark of sovereignty, of its arbitrariness and mystery, its absolute disregard for the things of this world, its autonomy even from the facts. It produces these truths in a closed box, a literal space of exception apart from the proof-finding processes of the law. If the question in this context is in fact an order, dime quién eres, tell me who you are, it's not just an order to answer, to produce the fictional truth of the state. It's this truth that the interrogation as a computer program is designed to produce. If the prisoner does not understand that and persists in telling the actual truth, the machine is stuck. Besides switching the input and producing such a fake truth, the only way out of this loop is to override it. So again, quote, hasta que llegó un muchacho y me dice, luego que dice, ¿cómo te llamas? Lucía Muñoz. ¿Cómo se llaman tus padres? Y ya le dije el nombre de mis papás. ¿Y cuántos hermanos tienes? Ya. Y dice, ok, dice, ¿sabes qué? Dice, enséñame tu brazo. Y le hace, yo voy a saber si es verdad lo que estás diciendo por tu vacuna. Y yo, ok. Y ya, le enseñé mi vacuna y luego ya dice, ok, dice, puedes pasar. Until a young guy showed up and he says to me, then he says, what's your name? Lucía Muñoz. What are your parents' names? And I told him my parents' names. And how many siblings do you have? And I told him. And he says, okay, he says, you know what? He says, show me your arm. And he's like, I'm gonna know if what you're saying is true because of your vaccine. And I go, okay. And so I did. I showed him my vaccine. And then, so he says, okay, he says, you can cross. Overriding allows the implementation of a subclass or child class, a mini program encrusted within the main program, somewhat as this officer is encrusted within US Customs and Border Protection, even though he arrives to the interrogation as if from outside it. He was a Mexican-American officer, Lucia said. The first, whose Spanish was easily comprehensible. What he was looking for on her arm was the scar from Lucia's tuberculosis vaccine. This vaccine is rare in the United States, but required in Mexico. The officer said that the scar proved that Lucia was telling the truth because he had been born in Tijuana and he had the same scar. Lucia was set free. She crossed the border. Like a deus ex machina, the officer uses the scar to stop the program, to override the loop Lucia was caught in. To make it work as proof, he incorporates it into a highly equivocal syllogism. You and I are alike, not in our ethno-racial identity, but in the scar we both bear, which indeed connects both of us with Mexico. Nevertheless, I am a US citizen. Therefore, you are too. Lucia was born in the US and the officer in Mexico, but his syllogism ignores this legally crucial difference to claim citizenship for both of them. Open secret at the border is, of course, that citizenship is a matter of race, whiteness, the body. The scar emerges from the secret, recognizes it, but twists away. It substitutes the embodied stamp of a national biomedical regime for the embodied signs of ethno-racial identity. It gives the state the bodily proof it desires while discreetly removing race from the equation. At the end of the day, it's his own racialized body that the officer mobilizes as the definitive proof. At first glance, the interrogation rendered Lucia's citizenship as embodied truth. It remains undecidable, however, if the scar signifies that she passed the test or if it incarnates the test's failure. In either case, the officer's syllogism cannot but appear as a pretext that resolves nothing. He probably believed her and made something up to end the torture. His syllogism repeats the nonsense of the entire interrogation. What's your name? Lucia Muñoz. What's your name? Lucia Muñoz. Upon hearing the story, I felt confused and pointed out that Lucia would have had the scar just the same if she'd been born in Mexico. Traería la vacuna, huh? She answered. I'd have the scar, yeah. Es ahí lo que yo no entiendo. Se la enseñé y dice, ok, dice, sí se te ve, dice, y ya, fue todo lo que me dijo. That's what I don't understand. I showed it to him and he says, okay, yeah, you can see it, he says. That was it. That's all he said to me. The interrogation changes nothing for Lucia. By the end, nothing is clear. It is no rite of passage or reintegration to the country where she was born. The next time she crosses, she will have to tell her story all over again. And indeed, she crossed this way for years, with just her birth certificate, supplemented by her narrative. Cuando mi papá murió, nosotros nos fuimos para Tijuana y a mi mamá le quitaron sus papeles. My dad died, we went to Tijuana, and they took my mom's papers away. Entering the United States does not confirm belonging. Quite the opposite. It reaffirms Lucia's marginality, her non-citizenship. Every time she passes the hall where the interrogation room is, los nervios me ganan, my nerves get the better of me, and the mere idea she might be sent back there makes her feel she has to urinate. Far from producing the truth, the interrogation produces a racialized non-citizenship that is constituted in the inconsistencies and ambiguities of the ritual itself, a poison citizenship that acts upon Lucia as a pharmacon. Crossing the border merely repeats the impasse that the interrogation ended in, reinscribing non-citizenship of the entire ethno-racial group to which she belongs. Similarly, Lawrence Ralph shows how police torture in Chicago helps criminalize Black people generally, for the torture rests on and reinscribes a presumption of guilt that is not individual, but racial. In Chicago, as at the border, I would suggest, racialized non-citizenship is constituted not in the reduction of rights, but more fundamentally in the likelihood and degree of exposure to sovereign violence, which is characteristically arbitrary, illogical, and unmeasured. If Lucia learns from this process of inscription, what she learns is a lesson of indeterminacy and nonsense. She learns that her person emits unexpected and uncontrollable signs that can be read a million ways. The state's interpretive practices turn her body and her words alike into a hieroglyph. They create invisibility. They create something that resists interpretation. In this cybernetic ritual, the state reveals itself, not a guarantor of rights meting out recognition, but a blind, fickle sovereign. The sovereignty takes shape in the interrogation itself, in its ritual structure, in the nonsense both of the repeated questions and of the denouement, and in the physical and psychological force that boxes Lucia's answers in and that reveals the interrogation as a genre of torture. Here, however, in the space where she remains unseen, Lucia has more to tell us. When Lucia told me what happened that day, she did not begin, as I did here, with the circumstances of her crossing. She began long before, with a day on which she cut class. She explained in detail how her mother had enrolled her in a particular school that was near the special needs school where her younger sister went, so that Lucia could take her little sister to school first before dashing over to her school, and how all of this was because her mother couldn't afford bus fare to take them to school herself, because imagine how many bus fares that would be every single day, and her mother had to go to work in any case. Lucia described how that particular day she started feeling lazy, how she decided to use her bus money to buy some chips, and how she ended up going to a park to kill time. At that time of day, the park was empty, but for an older woman who was jogging. Since no one was around, Lucia decided it was safe to leave her backpack in the corner and do some laps with the woman. When she was done, however, her backpack was no longer where she left it. It had been stolen. She told her mother a made-up story about substituted identities, in which a classmate had taken her bag by mistake. Her mother didn't believe her. Days later, Lucia took her birth certificate, that is the original birth certificate. She took it with her to school in order to photocopy it. On the way there, however, something happened. Iba cruzando la calle cuando pasó un carro, así cerquita de mí, pero cerquitita llegó. y hasta sentí así y me jalaron el brazo, como que me querían subir al carro. I was crossing the street when a car went by, like so really close to me, but it came really close. And I felt something like this, and they pulled my arm, like they wanted to pull me into the car. Fortunately, when she screamed, a man came out of a shop nearby, and the car took off without her. Once she got to school, she was so disturbed that she forgot all about her birth certificate. Since she'd already lost her backpack, she only had a notebook with her, and the birth certificate was inside the notebook. Since it was just a notebook, she asked a friend to keep it for her overnight. But she didn't go back to school the next day. It was almost summer vacation, and her mother decided it was better for her to stay home. When she returned to school in the fall, the friend was no longer there. In this narrative, losses, thefts, disappearances, and failures to appear echo into each other. The book bag and the birth certificate, Lucia's absence from school, her near kidnapping. This last is without doubt the most conclusive threat of disappearance in the series. Had she been stolen, and note that is the word that she uses, she would not have been able to appear anywhere else ever. She would have been lost forever. When we spoke a year later, she still struggled to articulate this idea. Me quedé todavía pensando de que pues sí me dio un buen susto el muchacho, pues él me jaló. Y ya llegué a la casa y todavía, y yo llorando porque no podía, o sea, no podía creer que como quien dice, me iban a robar. I kept thinking that the guy really scared me. He pulled me. And so I got home and still I was crying because I couldn't believe that like they say, they were gonna steal me. Note how Lucia seems to begin the phrase, me iban a robar, twice, breaking it off each time at the first word before she's able to speak it in full. And even then she hedges, marking the phrase as something that others say about other cases, not as words that are fully her own, but that she fully dares apply to her case. Lucia did not disappear that day, but her birth certificate did. The homologies stick to each other. The whole series of thefts and disappearances informs the interrogation. It was not the first time in which her person and her document were separated, and in which that separation marked an existential threat. In the interrogation, the questioning of her birth certificate's authenticity becomes a questioning of her own presence there as herself. No eres tú, it's not you. The interrogation seals the homology between herself and her birth certificate, both of them ephemeral, questioned, trapped in the impossibility of appearing when summoned. The interrogation's cybernetic approach does not just reduce Lucia's role in the communication, as Goffman suggested, it threatens to erase her. The first time the officers ask her name, it too threatens not to appear. Lucia Muñoz, Lu. No matter how many times she answers, she's never able to appear before the state. Even when the ritual is over, its strange conclusion denies her that. Accused of not being herself, of lying, of making substitutions, Lucia stutters her name. In Jane Hill's classic analysis of a Nahuatl narrative, Don Gabriel stutters the Spanish words associated with capitalism, marking his moral distance from it. In Lucia's narrative, disfluency is not accidental either. It marks the sovereign state's interruption of her subjectivity. The interrogation does not just produce Lucia as a individual, to recall Deleuze's term, chopping her up into a collection of data points. It's in fact bent on finding that those data points cannot be recomposed into an image of a person recognizable as Lucia Muñoz. At the end of the day, it's the incoherence of the data that the state seeks to. Lucia's stuttering of her name is not the only parapraxis marking her narrative. Throughout our conversation, there was a repeated question, almost as recurrent as that of the officers asking for her name. ¿Cómo te llamas? It was Lucia asking herself, or me, or no one in particular, for a word she couldn't remember. ¿Cómo se llama? What's it called? The words that refused to appear were almost all connected with especially sensitive points in the story. One was taxi, when she had to explain that the collective taxi left her a certain distance from school and that this was the reason that she had to walk that stretch where the man tried to kidnap her. Another missing word that never did materialize referred to what she began to do that led her family to send her to an orphanage. Through these missing words, the narrative itself construes something that interrupts it from beyond, that makes itself present in speech through an absence without revealing itself completely. Among these missing words, there was one main one that Lucia stumbled over multiple times. This was the word acta, birth certificate. ¿Cómo se llama? She'd say, almost like a tick, at top speed and extremely high pitch. She forgets the word just as after escaping the kidnapping, nunca me acordé de mi acta. I never remembered my birth certificate. Every time she repeats the question, she calls on the word to appear. But no matter how quickly she remembers it, its appearance is not enough to suppress the question, which returns. Just so Lucia, whose absence or failure to appear fully remains, no matter how many times she presents herself to the state. Mark Salter writes that ports of entry are spaces of legal exception, even for the most privileged of crossers. In the port of entry, everyone is stripped of their status as rights bearers. Everyone is subject to unconstitutional search and seizure. Privilege here is not a matter of enjoying rights, but of the minimization of one's chance of being abused. This is what I mean by thinking about governance in terms of differential vulnerability instead of differential citizenship, in a context where both Mexico and the United States increasingly rely on a mix of legal and de facto exceptions to achieve social order. The interrogation to which Lucia is submitted is but the unfolded, full-flowered version, the mini-interrogation to which every crosser must submit themselves. From this point of view, we are all non-citizens, if only we knew it. This idea is consistent with the question of non-citizenship within Mexico, likewise increasingly constituted by spaces of de facto exception in which one is exposed to what Claudio Lomnitz has recently called the negative sovereignty of crime. In Lucia's story, it's important to note, the interrogation does not have any primacy in installing inconsistency, absence, and non-identity in Lucia's being. Its gaps and impasses are but the compulsive repetition of a more fearsome violence she'd already undergone in Mexico. Lucia's narrative is a window onto a spinning web of exceptions that at once complement each other at a political economic level and converge in her narrative constitution of subjectivity. Her narrative merges her with her birth certificate and her backpack as figures of herself at risk of being stolen, forgotten, disappeared, or simply disappearing. And yet in bringing these figures of trauma and absence together, Lucia does something more. She weaves herself together again, not as a individual, but as a wholly subject, stitched of gaps, a subject that, for the state, is itself an absence, a glitch in its program that can't properly be seen. Articulating the complexity of her non-citizenship, Lucia escapes it. It's her life story, remember, that she presents in miniature to the US state to secure her every passage. As she does so, she dwells in its gaps and makes those gaps, that is, her non-citizenship, work for her, piecemeal and try by try, in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yeh, for this breathtaking and visual presentation. Dr. McConey.
Yes. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. In order to begin the conversation, what I wanted to do was to ask for some initial clarification, and then we can proceed. In Spanish, for example, does the term non-citizenship, is it equivalent to the English version, right, in Spanish? What I'm trying to work through in my own mind is whether, for example, the discussions about citizenship that you have articulated here are shaped to some extent by the ideological assumptions in English. When people talk about non-citizenship in Spanish, is it more or less the same? Does it resonate to the same degree as it does in English?
I mean, it would be a term made up by me, the same.
Oh,
I
okay.
haven't the same as in English. And I think that I think that at a broad level, I don't think that the difference would be so much linguistic. You can construct a term that's very parallel. It would just be like no ciudadanía, like you could do the same thing. But I think that the difference would be sort of in conceptions of citizenship between the US and Mexico more. Sort of like the ideas of like what citizenship consists of, what kind of privileges it gives, and how it's linked to social status.
Oh, okay. So the notion of citizenship in the US and Mexico are sort of different.
I think there are. I mean, of course, there are broad similarities, but I think there are different traditions because of the Spanish Republican tradition in Latin America is the sort of first big contrast.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So then can you sort of expand a little bit more for, at least for me and possibly some of my colleagues, what you meant by necro-citizenship?
So that's a term that Miguel Diaz-Barriga and Margaret Dorsey use, and I realize it's rather opaque in this context. I think that you know, they're riffing on Mbembe.
Yes.
But they're writing about southern Texas and they're writing about the US-Mexico from the US side, and they're talking about Mexican Americans. And so they're interested in a whole series of exceptions that overlap in that context, and they're interested in that are very recent. So they have an older article where they write about, so there's a conversation in the US, you've heard the term the Constitution Free Zone?
No, what is that?
So that's a term that's used to talk about this strip of land that is along it's 100 miles deep, I believe, that along the US-Mexico border on the US side. And traditionally, the Border Patrol had, so when the US Border Patrol was formed in the early 20th century, they very, very quickly, like I forget, the year after they were formed as a corporation, they got a legal exception. So they do not have to respect the US Constitution. You know, like the police have certain procedures they have to go through before they can search you, before they can ask for your ID. The Border Patrol don't have that. That doesn't apply to them. And this strip along this territorial strip along the border, that's called the Constitution Free Zone, because that's the strip of territory within which they traditionally had free reign to operate. They're not restricted to that strip, but that area, and if you've been to the US-Mexico border on the US side, there's also a whole sort of system of checkpoints a certain distance inland into the US, right? So it's the sort of strip between the border itself and these checkpoints, these Border Patrol checkpoints, where the Constitution doesn't apply.
It doesn't apply.
Yeah, so that's the sort of older conversation about lack of citizenship and how obviously the way that the Border Patrol applies its exception and decides who they are going to ask for papers is racialized, right? So so Diaz-Barriga and Dorsey, then they've written about how that works ethnographically and the ethnographic present, and then in their book where they talk about and introduce the term necro-citizenship, they talk about all these other exceptions that reduce the citizenship of Mexican Americans. So for example, to build the wall, the border wall, because that was national security and had to be done immediately. There were all these environmental laws that were suspended in order to accelerate that. There are also property rights that were suspended, right? So the people need, they need to, people's private property runs up to the border wall, but they need that space to build. So, sorry, you have to give up your home that you've lived in for generations. So those kinds of exceptions are what Diaz-Barriga and Dorsey are talking about. And the reason, to my understanding, the reason that they use this term Negro citizenship is because they want to argue that the sort of process of exclusion of Mexican Americans in this area is so intense that there's this sort of ultimate demand for a person's life in order to prove loyalty to the nation. So one of the things that they write about is the high incidence of military service, right? And the sort of public performances of patriotism from Mexican Americans who are, who go off to serve in the US military and risk their lives, but are, sort of extremely marginalized from the nation and have all these rights that are diminished. That's their
that's their core.
attempt to, yeah.
But then, how does Negro citizenship differ from what you were calling anti? Is there anything? I don't know whether you are the one who said it or I was creating it in my own head. Is there anything called anti-citizenship?
What are you thinking?
What I'm trying to work out is the way you were talking about, let's say, Negro citizenship and resistance to citizenship. Then I thought, oh, if that is the case, then there must be somebody who is interested in writing about anti-citizenship, because the citizenship, in the way it is framed in these discussions, is not necessarily something that is positive.
Right.
Right. So there must be, now let me explain to you why this word is made a little bit. If there is something called anti-citizenship, which is a good thing to some extent, then I'm at a loss to understand the movement in sociolinguistics in what is called citizenship sociolinguistics. There's this movement, people who are interested in citizenship sociolinguistics, because they frame it more or less as a positive movement. But if citizenship itself is potentially a negative and discriminatory thing, I'm not sure how citizenship sociolinguistics helps us address in a positive light issues about discrimination. Right.
So I'm not sure that I'm familiar. I'm pretty sure I'm unfamiliar with the discussion that you're thinking of in social linguistics. Could you fill me in a little bit?
Yeah. What I'm saying is there are some people who are working on what they call citizenship sociolinguistics. That is, to some extent, and let me paraphrase them a little bit. They are interested in what they think are issues about social justice, etc. But they put this under the broad rubric of citizenship sociolinguistics. I get what they're trying to do, but I think intellectually, the framework of citizenship doesn't get them there, because the framework of citizenship creates more troubles for them than they may want to, than they are willing to acknowledge. Or for example, in language policy and planning discussions, where they have got discussions about linguistic citizenship, for example. And they prefer the notion of linguistic citizenship to the issue of, to the notion of language rights. But the argument that I'm trying to make, which I've made with some of my colleagues like Ashraf, etc., who is here, has also made, is that the problem which is there is that the notion of citizenship itself is so problematic that it doesn't help you in getting towards, in your quest to advocate for language rights. In other words, the notion of citizenship undercuts the idea of rights. The two of them can't go hand in hand. And your studies, for example, to some extent provides further evidence about the problematic nature of citizenship. Somebody has their birth certificate and they're a US citizen, but they're still treated as if they are not what? They're not a citizen. I may be a US citizen, but when I get through to the airport, I'm just treated like any black migrant laborer, for example.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That the way I'm racialized is more important than the citizenship and passport that I hold. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think, yeah, no, I get what you're saying about the linguistic citizenship. There's a certain sort of liberal optimism in it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think exactly. I mean, I think at the, like here at this border, it generates like the system generates some confusion, right?
Yes.
Because it is definitely a privilege to be able to enter the US with papers, right?
Yes.
But it's not, but that privilege is not, it's still a problem, right? It's like, what are you exposing to yourself to in that process? And I do think ultimately it is a threat of death, right? So in Lucia's case, it's this interrogation, and the whole point is she's a US citizen, and this is the ritual that affirms that citizenship. And it's extremely violent and marginalizing, right? But at the same time, I mean, there's I think so since Obama Obama's known as the deporter in chief, right? For this term, right? So since that era, one of the things that has increased is literal violence and the killing of Mexican citizens by border officers, right? So it's not a very large number of people, right? But that number has increased, or did increase then, and yeah, it's a little hard to track. I think they're sort of different figures from different agencies and so on, but they're very emblematic. Those killings are extremely emblematic. There are some that have been caught on cell phone video, and the videos have been circulated and this sort of thing. So those are sometimes people who have papers to cross into the United States, right? And so yeah. I think that the question is the sort of the idea that inclusion is possible, and that language can be like one pathway towards greater inclusion, and it's much more complicated and treacherous, right?
Thanks. Let me give you back to Phoebe, because there may be one or two people who want to ask a couple of questions, then we can continue. Phoebe, is there anybody who wants to jump in?
Thank you, Dr. Marconi. We don't have any questions yet, but I have a question. I have a question. Okay. Cecile has one, so Cecile, Cecile, you can go.
No, go ahead, Phoebe. You went first.
I'm the moderator, so I can always go. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Yi, for sorry if I mispronounce your surname. I've got a question regarding your data and your analysis. So what you presented were excerpts of your interviews with, what's the name again of the person? Lucia, sorry. So what you presented were excerpts of your interview with Lucia. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, but you treat them as, so it's a recounting, it's her recounting of her interactions.
Exactly.
But you seem to treat it as, data that we're recording during the actual interaction. So you don't, basically, in your analysis, you don't, at least what you presented, you don't seem to take that into account, that it's a recounting. And for example, you didn't, if I'm not mistaken, you didn't present the question that Lucia was answering unless she was giving, several minutes of narratives about the whole procedure that you didn't trigger through that you didn't elicit through your questions?
Wait, sorry, could you say this last part again? What is it that I'm leaving? I mean, I got the part that I'm not taking into account that it's a recount.
No,
but
I'm not.
The last bit that you were saying?
Yeah. For example, I didn't see any interaction between you and Lucia that produced what she recounting. So my question is that did she give this minute or hour-long narrative without you prompting anything from her, or did you actually, by your question prompted her way of narrating what happened during this, interaction with the police or the border police? Because it would make a big difference for me as an interactionalist, interactional scholar, to know that some of what she recounted actually was elicited by your questions.
Okay, so I don't believe that it's possible to do an interview without
that's not the point.
Being there, and that she's
that's not the point.
A vacuum or something. So yes, I am sure that the way that whatever I said to her, I was not completely silent for, I don't remember how long at the moment the conversation was, an hour, I don't remember exactly how long it was right now. But yes, of course, I said things during that. It was a conversation, although she spoke most of the time. At the very beginning, I can tell you that, so when I explained at the end that she didn't narrate it the way that I presented it here, right? So she didn't start where I started. So I knew previously about this incident. And at the beginning of the conversation, I asked her to tell me about that day. And from the recording, it's clear that she didn't expect that. And yeah, that she didn't expect it, but she accepted I was also older than her. I mean, she was 17 at the time. I was working primarily with her older sister. And yeah, so she began this narrative. I was quite lost for a very long time because she chose to narrate this long story about losing her backpack, and then about losing her birth certificate. Then it began to become a little clearer where she was going. But I think she had in the overall sort of shape of the narrative, and the way that she narrated, I believe that she had a great deal of control. I'd have to look very carefully at what I interpolated. But the basic thing was that I asked her to tell me about that incident when the first time that she went to the US, basically.
Yeah, but my point is not that. My point is that I think, because in what you presented, which may be different in the paper you are writing, it seems that you don't take into account the fact that she reconstructing the whole event. And I think it would add an additional, layer to your analysis. I'm not saying that I'm not talking about accuracy of what she's saying. I'm not talking about that, I'm just talking about the analysis. And I think that would be actually very interesting that you bring into your theoretical framework, all the work that has been done on narratives and stuff like that, combined with your interactional analysis between the officer and her. I think it will really enrich, it would add an additional layer. That's just what I'm pointing out, actually.
I see. Was there anything in particular? So I am interested, I do, through the bulk of the talk about the interrogation as such. I said at the beginning that I am discussing her narrative, and through it, the interrogation. So obviously I don't have access to an interrogation. I will never have access to an interrogation, and working with a narrative. That's very clear. So, but in talking about the sort of cybernetic comparison, the comparison to cybernetics and so on, yes, I'm talking about the interview insofar as I'm able to infer what went on. I mean, it's a very broad strokes sort of argument at that stage, right? That it was divided into these 3 stages, according to her, that the questioning was such in this stage, and the way that it changed at the 3 different stages, right? But obviously there's no sort of detailed analysis of what they really said and what she really said.
I mean,
No,
that's
and
not the point.
Interested, as far as the as far as her narrative, I worked with, I used Leboff a little on her evaluative comments, the way she frames it, the way she appeals to me at different points, the way she uses direct and indirect discourse, the way she uses tense. But I don't know, is there anything else in particular that stood out to you as interesting to think about?
Well, there are lots of people who worked on, I don't know if you know the work of Ana Delfina, who worked a lot on, especially on narratives by Mexican migrants, but there is a lot of things. I mean, I'm sure you can start with her work and you will find a lot of resources, references in her work. Yeah. But I really believe it would bring a very interesting layer, because basically it's a recounting. So it's interesting that when I wonder to what extent, why I'm asking that is I wonder to what extent there is a kind of pattern of narrating this kind of traumatic event, so which would which wouldn't invalidate our own experience, but actually which would point out how certain kind of experience are discursively patterned when they are recounted, So I don't know, it's just, an idea, something that you may want to explore.
Yeah, I mean, work on narrative and literature and trauma is actually what I'm trained in. So that's why I'm asking for maybe more concrete pointers of things to develop. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, that was why I was basing the end of the discussion really centered on her narrative and the gaps in her narration and the disfluencies and this sort of thing, because I think those are sort of, classic. They connect very well to the way that narratives of trauma have been written around. Yeah, thank you. But I did not know Ana Delfina. I know Ana Delfina's name, but I had not read her work, so I will look into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecile. Does anyone else have a comment or a question? Okay, so I have one. Well, two actually. First is a comment. Thank you so much for this visual description of what happened to the crossing. And as a Black African, I can relate to going through the US airports, even with an American passport, and going through some of these things, the stripping, the emotional part of it, of what it means of the fact that, it doesn't matter your citizenship, you're racialized. But anyway, I wanted to find out, in Mexico, how did Lucia experience belonging as an American citizen? Or yes, how was she perceived by the community and by herself? Did she get the non-citizenship? How did she experience that, as in both by herself and by the community on the Mexican side of things?
So I think that I think mostly she was quite integrated with everyone around her, with her family, with the neighborhood. But there was so at the beginning I described sort of how I became interested in Cari and Lucia, and that was because I was living with a neighbor of theirs doing field work, and some of the sort of older women in that area would make disparaging remarks about them. So the idea was that, in this sort of imaginary of precisely what causes confusion about the value of citizenship, right? They believe that if you're a US citizen, then you should live well. And if you are not living well, it must be your fault, right? So these, the sisters basically challenged this sort of imaginary of what Hillary Dick calls a modernist chronotope, right, in which sort of South and North in Mexico are aligned with progress, right, and citizenship sort of and legal status sort of plays into that imaginary, right? So sort of personal progress is narrated often as a movement from, in migrations narratives, as a movement from South to North, right? So I feel like that was what the neighbors were drawing on and really, criticizing that. I mean, these were adult women, right? And Gary and Lucia were teenagers. But yeah, they would make comments all the time about how, look at them, look at how they're living, and they're US citizens, can you believe it? And I think Gary was really responding to that, because there's a big difference between them. Gary was very much the older sister, and even though there's just a small difference in age, she is extremely organized and driven and extremely sharp about getting everybody back into the United States. It was incredibly difficult. I mean, they were extremely poor. The other thing what presented a real obstacle was that since they didn't have any papers, they had no access to the formal job market. So they couldn't work. So in that sort of social milieu, the sort of main easiest job to get that most people had was working in the transnational assembly plants, in the assembly plant industry, but that's actually formal employment, right? So that wasn't accessible to them. And where the neighborhood was actually sort of in front of a big sort of industrial area, it was right there in front, across the highway. So there's lots of informal employment, right? But Gary had basically had to rely on that, and the sort of main, most available, common, lower working class source of employment wasn't available. Yeah, so that's what I meant when I was saying, like, yes, there were real obstacles. On the other hand, it didn't seem to have been an obstacle for her to enroll in school. She had been she went to school, she went through middle school. So yeah, I feel like the comments about them being US citizens were these sort of snarky comments behind their backs, but otherwise they were, living in a social world in which their citizenship didn't radically distinguish them from the other people. And there's tons of cases of mixed status families on both sides of the border. And in Mexico, their case, in Tijuana, at least at the border, that case of being US citizen and not having Mexican citizenship, but being, ethnically Mexican it's not uncommon, right? Especially if you think of kids, whose parents were deported, and so they grew up back in the States, which is basically more or less their case.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Okay. And is there anybody who has got a question that they want to raise?
Busi has one, please. Busi,
Okay,
you can go.
jump in, Busi.
My question really relates to, thank you very much for an interesting talk. And I actually found it fascinating in the sense that some of the things we were talking about are very familiar, but from a very different context, the context of Southern Africa. Particularly when other African migrants are entering into South Africa or have entered into South Africa. And now when they are within South Africa, not so much like their movements are being policed, but the police are always out to get migrants, to arrest them for being in the country illegally. And one of the things that you said that struck me, because I had heard it in Southern Africa, but I hadn't heard it in any other context, was the use of vaccination scars as markers of belonging. And there is a lot of that in Southern Africa. But what has become, what is interesting from a research point of view is, at least for how accurate is it as a marker of belonging? Because in a South African context, it has created sometimes very embarrassing scenarios where, in one instance, I recall the son of the former governor of the Reserve Bank was arrested as suspected of being an illegal immigrant and put into a deportation process. But of course, he was a local South African. And that's just one example, but there have been incidents of South Africans themselves being either deported into neighboring countries because they are suspected based on the vaccination scar that they come from this particular country. But in fact, they are local South Africans. I myself have never been able to figure out from the scar which person, or well, which country the person comes from, because to me they look the same. So I just wondered from your experience whether there have been in the Mexican border side these incidents of misreading of vaccination scars.
Yeah, I have not seen, like, in the contemporary context, I don't know of other cases where that became relevant, and I think of it as a sort of idiosyncrasy of that officer, of that official. Of course, in this case, it is a misreading. I mean, it isn't a misreading, because if you, I mean, I think logically, and I think Lucia agreed with me, was that the scar, she had the scar because she had to go live in Mexico from when she was very little, but the scar would indicate that she grew up in Mexico, right? So so it doesn't prove U.S. citizenship. So it's a sort of inverse of the sort of mistaken confidence in the vaccine. However, historically, the smallpox vaccine has had, I don't know too much about it, but if you're interested, I can pass you the reference. I came across it in a book on the history of the border. And the smallpox vaccine, apparently there were a lot of issues around it. And what I read was that Mexico was one of the first countries, at least in Latin America, I think, to eliminate smallpox. And they had very widespread vaccination campaigns. And from very early on, like in the, I guess, late 19th century, the vaccination mark was understood in Mexico as a sort of sign of civilized modernity. But at the border, a lot of the US officials disbelieved the scar. So they doubted the veracity of the scar, and they thought they were fake. They thought they were fake vaccination scars. So I don't know, I can pass you the information if you're interested in that.
Thank you.
I'm interested in that because I just want to read more about it to see where it takes us.
Thank you. I think Marie had her hand up.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. I was sort of interested in learning more about crossing genre. Like, I have been detained quite a few times because of my skin color at Canadian borders, in Britain, of course, the United States, the worst. And so the cybernetic ideology of communication was really clear when I was interrogated. And I have, American passport and Canadian passport, and it didn't matter. So there are really particularity about that dialogue that took interrogation that took place, because it was at the Mexican-US border and because of who was being interrogated. But is there sort of like common features of this kind of crossing, interrogation dialogue? And this is just sort of like a variation of it?
Yeah, I don't know. This is the only sort of extended narrative of an extended interrogation that I've seen. I don't, I mean, I was saying it's a sort of longer version of the sort of mini interrogation everyone goes through at the beginning, but I don't have information on the genre more widely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Oh, no. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Right.
Thank you, Marie.
And
Do we have any other questions? Otherwise, I will invite
oh,
Dr.
Scott,
Montoni.
yes, Scott has a question.
Oh, Scott, you can go.
Michael Scott.
No, I didn't. Oh, Michael Scott. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Michael,
Mm.
I think there's a question.
He's not
It's in the
here.
chat.
It's in the chat.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how far back it might go. Like I say, I really think of it as something rather idiosyncratic of this officer and kind of creative on his part, and a strange sort of, I mean, it's just impossible. It's just pure speculation what he was trying to do, you know, as Cecile Vigouroux was saying, it's a narrative, and his motivations are quite opaque. I would say he does seem to be sort of saving face for the state, right? But yeah, beyond that, I don't know.
Thank you. Cecile, you can go.
Yes, thank you. I think your work broadly, I mean, shows that we as scholars need to be more, need to develop a more refined lexicon about migrant, migration, etc. That's why in my work, I always state institutionally ratified citizen, institutionally ratified migrants. I know it sounds very long, but actually what you show is that the institutional ratification of citizenship actually on the ground doesn't matter when you are a racialized person. You know, that's what it shows. So I think we need to be, I think we need to really, scholars of migration really need to develop a more refined, you know, lexicon to talk about that. And mind you that migration studies are based on a reification of the nation state, because when you leave the nation state out of the picture, the notion of migrant really doesn't matter. And that's why, you know, you have in the US specifically, but in Canada, there are so many indigenous groups actually who don't want to ratify the nation state. And you have lots of struggles between migrants who want to be recognized as, you know, legitimate citizens, but who have indigenous people say, by doing that, you are actually oppressing us because you are, you know, ratifying the colonial state. You know, so, and that's why I think we really need to be very, in our work as migration scholars, we need to be super careful about the ways in which we, you know, we borrow institutional categories that actually, you know, are not relevant, you know, state category. And by borrowing state categories of citizenships, etc., we actually, you know, in a way, we endorse the validity of the state, you know, in regimenting, you know, people's right to live wherever they want, or people's right to access services and stuff like that. So I think we always need to be super careful when we borrow state categories, and one of them is the category of citizen. Okay, so maybe the problem is not the state, the problem is us ratifying the logic of the state.
That's why I like the term non-citizenship. Because the thing is that I think it's one thing to ratify, to sort of use state categories unreflectively. On the other hand, they have a ethnographic reality. Right? That is, people are categorized, and if you're making an ethnographic account of that, you need to deal with that, with the way that people understand the legal categories and yeah, how they interact with these institutions and try to negotiate.
Yeah,
the
sure.
systems
But
that
how they understand them, how they align with them, how, you know, that's what we need to study. And in your case, Luisa actually believe in that.
Sorry?
And when in your case, in the case of Luisa really believes in the power of this category of citizen that should enable her to move freely between one nation state to another.
I disagree with that. I don't think that she believes in it profoundly. I think she's actually, there's a large, I think there's a great distance, and that's one of the interesting things about her. I think there's a very pragmatic approach to the birth certificate. But I think that precisely this experience of having her non-citizenship sort of ground into her and ground into her face gives her a great deal of critical distance and skepticism in relation to US recognition. And I find that very productive in comparison, for instance, to many people in Tijuana who have tourist visas, who have the US visa to visit temporarily.
But wouldn't you say that without this experience, she would have believed that she was a regular, you know, when it came to cross the border, without this experience or the several, you say she crossed twice, but would you say that without having this experience with the police, with the border police, would you say that she would have, you know, she would believe that she was a regular American citizen because of the papers she held?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Okay.
Because she was ejected from the United States at an extremely young age, as a child, almost before her memory began. And so she never had access to any sort of part of the United States. Her family was excluded from the United States, and she was unable to visit the United States at all, even to see what it was like, until she was 15 years old. And then this happened to her.
Okay.
So no, I do not think she would make such an assumption at all. Yeah.
Okay.
I think,
Thanks.
yeah.
Thank you. Michael West has comments, and she thanks you, Dr. Ye, for your presentation, which certainly informs the ongoing headlines in Portland, Maine, where they welcomed many immigrants who actually made it across the southern US border. But with the new Biden administration, immigration dispensation seems likely to be stemmed. So your presentation is very thought-provoking and useful.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think also that, no, I mean, I agree completely about the sort of care and precision in how migration, different forms of movement, and not just forms of movement in relation to legal regimes, is talked about, precisely because I think it is transforming so much, and quite quickly. And that's a sort of ulterior sort of aim of the sort of idea of non-citizenship, is to decenter state sovereignty, right, and state categories. So I'm beginning to think of those sort of, sort of maximal performances of state sovereignty. For instance, when an agent kills someone, when an agent of the state kills someone, as these performative moments that make the state appear very, vigorous, which are all the more important in a moment when so much of the sort of actual work of governmentality and of the policing of movement is being outsourced and spread across various nation states, and is being sort of shared and articulated, right? So, I mean, Mexico is a really prominent case, right, in which it's Mexican immigration enforcement is certainly Mexican, but has very much been recruited into a US project of externalization of its borders. And it goes way beyond Mexico, of course, within the Western Hemisphere.
I want to ask you a question that I should know, which I should have an answer to, but I don't. Are there any language scholars that take part in training border patrol officers. Let's say we would train the border patrol officers in the areas of interrogation, etc. Are they, or is that area completely, we don't get access to those people?
No, I think that's just extremely, I mean, I only really know, I mean, not even just like specifically language scholars, but I mean, the person who comes to mind who did ethnography, you know, just a social cultural anthropologist was working with the Border Patrol was Josiah Heyman. But his field work was in the early 90s. And as he continued, he lost access, and he wasn't particularly, you know, he wasn't terribly critical, right? He was really interested in the sort of everyday labor of, you know, of border officers as sort of, I don't think he used the term like street level bureaucrats, but that sort of approach. Yeah, it's extremely, even to get an officer for an interview is I mean, I've known people who have tried to do it and have thought of maybe doing it through family networks, you know, if they have cousins who have worked for Border Patrol or so, but it's incredibly difficult. Yeah.
And then my second question is, you are focusing on one border. The question that what was going through my mind is as follows. Do these borders and border patrol officers behave in a similar way across different parts of the country? Let's say you are focusing on this border. Let's say if you had gone, and let's call it border 1, if you had gone to another border opposite that in border 2, are the dynamics different? Right. Does the crossing take place differently in border 2, and the patrol officers they relate to the people who are crossing differently? In other words, is there any texture about crossing borders that varies depending on where you are? That you would say, if I migrate like myself, oh, I'm going to go via border 2 because I think I'm likely to meet more friendly patrol officers than if I go to border 3.
I think they're different. I mean, but we heard the testimony from Mary Caneda.
Yes.
So, you know, I mean, I do think it has a lot to do with sort of probabilities and one's the chance of one thing or another happening. And I don't think that it's that I think that part of how this particular institution works, the Customs and Border Protection, is by haphazardness and by sort of lack of training of officers and lack of. I understand that under Trump advertised in right-wing media for there were a lot of advertisements and sort of recruitment in right-wing media for border officers, and so that might have, you know, sort of drawn people with a certain disposition in at that point and sort of stacked the agency in, with readers of Breitbart. But I think it's a little, I mean, there's even a lot of variation along this border from port to port in how they interact, and how even in Tijuana, there's 3 different ports of entry actually, and they're each in my personal experience, they're different.
They're different.
Yeah.
Then the reason is, why are they different?
Well, I mean, that's my speculation, but right here, for instance, the San Isidro port of entry, which is where Lucia was interrogated, it's the oldest port of entry. It's one of the biggest in the world. I think now it's probably like the 4th most transited port in international port of entry in the world. So it's very massive. So I think the officers are under a lot of pressure. They're under a lot of pressure to move people through very quickly, and thus come to make decisions very quickly on individuals. And the other port of entry here is more dedicated. There's a lot of sort of, I don't know, sort of regular people moving through it, but it's also mainly dedicated, or not mainly, but it was built for trucks for truck, and I don't think it's I don't think it's a sort of official difference, but I think probably it's more of a difference of how the officers feel and the kind of pressure they're under and what they expect and things like this.
Okay,
I don't know.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, Marconi, there is a show I've been binge watching called Border Control. I don't know if any of you have ever watched it. So it's all over the world, and so you see the kind of line of questioning that that people have. They have one in a show in Colombia, Canada, the US, etc. But what is interesting about this show, I did a paper on a passport forgerer.
Yeah.
So in South Africa, and actually the guy was extremely aware of this show. We were comparing notes on this show because it was very useful for him, you know, to know what kind of questions they were asking, because they explain to you how sometimes there are episodes where they show you how they see that the passport is fake.
Yes.
So, no, so this becomes a resource for these guys who try actually to move people from one side of the world to the other. So, and that's the closest I've seen of, you know, the line of questioning that border officers across the world. It's very patterned. It's interesting, yeah, to see it from different. Of course, they don't show everything, but the snippets they show is actually very informative for us who work on migration and stuff like that. So I highly recommend, but be careful, it's very addictive.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cecile. So we have a comment from Dinah Camps, and then Marie, you can go. Dinah says, thank you for an interesting presentation. She's based in the UK and agrees with Cecile's caution about the reification of state categories, but also recognizes how the instrumentalization of citizenship is necessary to secure even basic human rights. She's not sure how to get around this dilemma. Thank you for your comment, Dinah. Marie, you can go.
Okay. I'm not sure whether my question is answerable, and it's really half-baked, but I wondered if there is such thing as shades of crossing. When I came to that, I had to cross the border to come back to validate my work visa, and then you know, it was a long line, so I started to talk with different people, and there are different types of people who travel through. So this is sort of one shade of crossing, and that what happened at the interrogation. Do you think there are different shades? Like, is this multi-layered process, even with respect to the interrogation itself, depending on who's being interrogated? And of course, as you said, it could be haphazard. If it was a scar, maybe the next person would, use something else. So I was wondering about shades of crossing.
So shades is a way of getting at the sort of subtle, all the sort of different factors that can play into an interaction going different ways. So
Marconi was asking about multi-site, right? There's some asking about within the site.
Yeah.
Dimension.
Yeah. I think there's just so there was someone I think just the experience of crossing, even, without any particular interrogation, just the sort of everyday experience of crossing. So this border, there's a huge amount of people who commute, which now includes myself, and who commute across the border. And just observing the sort of those different really short interactions with the officers and how they vary is a sort of endlessly interesting, endlessly interesting. And the officers' sort of personal tack that they take and different, you know, the patterning, there's not a huge room for variation, and yet there's all kinds of variation constantly. Yeah, I think I like the idea of shades. I think there's just a huge range. And I think the other thing about sort of what I was saying earlier about probability is I think that it's that obviously I mean, you brought up the color of your skin and being targeted for the color of your skin, but
Yeah.
there's obviously racialization is a huge part of this, but it can also be very unpredictable. And that's why I thought Mark Salter's point was interesting, which was that technically a port of entry is legally a space of exception. And, you know, I was explaining the idea of the Constitution free zone earlier, right? And how people can be targeted in the Constitution free zone. But in the port of entry, everyone is subject to search and seizure, right? And everyone's bags are scanned. And there's a relinquishment of rights for everyone, right? So even the most privileged of travelers who have, you know, global entry status to, you know, jet set across the world are also moving through this space and are potentially, in theory, legally also vulnerable in that space. So I think that's a really sort of important thing to remember also. Yeah.
Just to note, I really like your term non-citizenship because that's how I felt, you know, when I was
Yeah.
questioned.
Yeah.
Repeat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's what questioning does to you.
You know, you're a legitimate citizen, and but then you're being stripped of your entitlement and your rights in that
Yeah.
particular space. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. And it is about all kinds of, you know, not just legal status, but it is about cultural citizenship and linguistic belonging, and all of these things are, I think, maybe my favorite interaction with an officer. It was many years ago, but it was a very large white man and very imposing, and he took a stern line with me, and he was basically playing the role of a tough, nasty immigration officer. And I don't know why, there was something about his demeanor that made me smile at him a little bit. And as soon as I smiled, it was like we were both part of this inside joke. And he was just pretending. And I got the joke that he was just acting out this role, and we were both American, and we both got it. And then we just shared this little chuckle together. It was a very strange, revealing sort of moment. Yeah. And
Thank
that was what granted me passage.
Thank you.
Maybe you should do if you cross the border on a regular basis, maybe you should document your interactions with,
I actually do.
Yeah, no, that
I write it out afterwards.
No, that would be sweet. There is a paper that's going to be published in the Journal of Social Linguistics that I reviewed, and this racialized Dutch documented her passing entering the Netherlands, and she shows that how even if she has a Dutch passport, she interacts in Dutch with the border officer. They systematically address her in English.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they end
Yeah.
up speaking a foreign language to each other.
Yeah.
And that's very enlightening that's why I say that would be actually great to how you reflect on your interaction with those guys and see, you know, how pattern it is, what appears to be relevant in the kind of interaction that, you know, I think that would make a wonderful paper.
I think so too. Many people can write that paper. That would be great. Yeah. Yeah. May I ask who you said the paper is coming out?
Oh yeah, I'm gonna try to find it in my. I'll post it on the chat. The name of the author. Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Cecile. And
And then
Marie,
there's,
Tabohu has a comment. Tabohu says, first, thanks you for the exploration of border control and state authority, and says that the bottom line is that while globalization continues to challenge states, there are powerful sentiments and support for the states, such that in the distant future, we will still have state authority. It is a necessary inconvenient institution for a long time to come. To support the state, limited resources forces competition of states and people for ownership of state power and resources. So there will always be control in state and regional citizenship and rights. So this is his comment. I don't know if you have anything to say in response.
I feel like the globalization, at this point, at least when you think about border enforcement, it's reinforcing the state in it's both reinforcing and undermining the state, I think, in the sense that I think that the outsourcing of border enforcement, I mean, it's a formation of empire, I think, really. But like I was saying earlier, I think it pushes, it motivates these sort of more exaggerated performances of state sovereignty, more and more reliance on the exception, on legal exception and de facto exceptions to govern, even as like the sort of process of government is spread out through this highly articulated network of institutions, which from one perspective you say, oh, that's undermining the state. Like it's not the US state directly, enforcing the border in Central America, enforcing borders in Central America, but it's more, advising and financing Central American states and the Mexican states processes of border enforcement. Yeah, when Cecilia was talking about the show Border Control, which I haven't seen, I was sort of wondering like, oh, well, what hand might the United States have in that, in any similarities that can be seen, because they're very actively going around and giving workshops and trainings and to, different immigration enforcement agencies around the world. So I don't know if that makes sense or addresses your comment.
Thank you, Dr. Ye. Dr. Makoni, if you have any final comments, or if there are any other questions, we'll take them, but otherwise, we'll call Dr. Makoni for final comments, and then Kim can tell us what's next.
This was a fascinating presentation about immigration. I want to conclude it by recalling my own limited experiences of immigration when I was trying to get into the United Kingdom. And then the Zimbabweans, that time I was holding a Rhodesian passport. So what was happening was that the Rhodesians, the Zimbabweans who were in Malawi, were teaching us how to respond to the British patrol passport officers when we get to Heathrow. So they will give you some formulaic statements like, or they ask you, why are you trying to get into the UK with a passport that has expired? You tell them that the British colonized Rhodesia and you are coming back home. So it was interesting that even amongst the immigrants themselves, there was a sense of how do you outsmart the border patrol officers themselves, what you should say and what you should not say, etc., which I thought was quite an interesting thing. And that those formulaic expressions proved to be very helpful when I got to Heathrow, because with the courage that comes from being young, when they were asking me, why do I want to get into the United Kingdom? I don't have money, etc. I could also repeat all those statements that I had been told by colleagues that just insist that the British government has responsibilities towards Rhodesia. Rhodesia was a former colony. And I could see the British patrol officer more or less giggling, but he allowed me through. Do you know anybody who can look after you when you're here? I said, yes, I've got an aunt of mine. Do you know the passport number? Do you know the telephone number? I said, yes. And she called my aunt, and my aunt came and collected me, and I went through. So there are ways of undermining these systems. But anyway, this has been a fascinating presentation. And now let me give over to Kim to tell us about our next session.